There is a moment that arises for certain people, not everyone, but a few. It does not come with a flash of lightning or some dramatic turning point. It does not appear because you happen to read the perfect book, or met the ideal teacher, or attended a life-changing retreat in the mountains. It simply comes quietly, almost unnoticed, like a small window opening in a room that has been sealed shut for years. And in that moment, something within you begins to recognize that the life you have been living, the version of yourself you have been acting out, the game you have been playing without ever questioning the rules, none of it fits the way it once did. The shoes feel too tight, the mask feels too heavy, the script you have been following feels like it was written for someone else entirely. That is what some people refer to as a spiritual awakening, and it is worth clarifying something about that phrase, because many people hear it and immediately imagine someone sitting cross-legged on a mountaintop, glowing with perfect peace. That is not what this is about. What this points to is something far more ordinary and at the same time far more real. At its core, a spiritual awakening is simply the process of becoming more honest. More honest about who you truly are, more honest about what you genuinely want, more honest about what you have been carrying that never really belonged to you in the first place. When that process begins, something interesting starts to happen. You begin letting things go, not because you planned to or because someone told you to, but because you find that you simply cannot hold on to them anymore. It is as if your hands slowly and naturally begin to open. What follows are 7 patterns, habits, and ways of being that people often report falling away as they start waking up to their deeper selves. These are not things you consciously decide to stop. They are things that quietly become impossible to continue. If you have been feeling lately as though something inside you is shifting, as though you are becoming someone you do not quite recognize yet, as though the things that once motivated you are losing their pull, then this may resonate deeply. The first thing that begins to fade is the hunger for approval. This is one of the most deeply ingrained patterns most people carry. The need for others to confirm that you are okay runs very deep. Think about how early this need takes root. From childhood, approval becomes a kind of currency for survival. When you behave the right way, you are rewarded with smiles. When you achieve something, you receive praise. When you fit in, you gain acceptance. Even subtle rejection can feel like a small crisis to the nervous system. Over time, you learn to scan the room, to read the atmosphere, to adjust yourself accordingly. By adulthood, this process becomes almost automatic. You shape your opinions depending on who is present. You soften certain parts of yourself. You say yes when you really mean no. You laugh at things you do not truly find funny. You hold back your truth and highlight only what seems acceptable. For a long time, this seems to work, or at least it keeps things running smoothly. It maintains social harmony and gives the feeling of belonging. But something shifts when awakening begins. The need for approval starts to lose its grip. You might find yourself in the middle of a conversation, about to say what others expect to hear, and suddenly something inside you resists. Not out of rebellion or stubbornness, but from something deeper. It feels as though your body no longer tolerates the old patterns. People often describe this in very similar ways. One person compared it to trying to wear a coat that once fit perfectly, but has now shrunk several sizes. They kept trying to put it on, but it no longer worked. Eventually, they had no choice but to set it aside. That is what letting go of approval-seeking feels like. You do not make an announcement. You do not declare your authenticity. You simply become unable to keep performing in the same way. This transition is not always comfortable. There is often a period where you have internally loosened the need for approval, but have not yet adjusted your external life. You may still notice yourself checking for validation or feeling a sting when it is absent. But now, you are aware of it. You can see the pattern instead of being completely inside it. On the other side of this shift lies something remarkable, a quiet sense of self-worth that does not depend on external confirmation. It is not arrogance or indifference, but a calm knowing that your value does not need to be measured or approved by others. The second thing that starts to fall away is the need to be seen as special. This might sound surprising because it seems like something positive. But there is a difference between being authentically yourself and needing to be perceived as exceptional. Early in personal growth, it is common for the ego to adopt new forms. You may have a genuine insight or meaningful experience, and then subtly begin using it as a way to stand out. You might reference your practices, mention deeper concepts, or feel quietly superior to those who have not had similar experiences. This phase is real and quite common. But as awareness deepens, something shifts. You begin to notice yourself in these moments. You hear your own words differently. You realize you are using meaningful experiences as a kind of performance. One person described being at a dinner gathering, explaining ideas about consciousness to people who had not even asked. Suddenly, it felt as though he was watching himself from a distance. What he saw did not feel expansive or wise. It felt small and insecure. That moment changed something. He stopped needing others to recognize his depth. And what he discovered afterward was unexpected. When the need to stand out disappears, your true self begins to show up naturally. Without the performance, what remains is simpler, more genuine, and oddly more compelling. Being ordinary no longer feels like a loss. It feels like relief. The third thing that fades is the performance of constant positivity. In many environments, especially those centered around growth and spirituality, there is pressure to always appear calm, happy, and at peace. Difficult emotions are often avoided or masked with uplifting language. But as awareness deepens, this mask becomes harder to maintain. It starts to feel heavy. Eventually, it becomes impossible to keep pretending. What follows is not a fall into negativity, but a movement toward honesty. Emotions are no longer suppressed. Grief is allowed to be grief. Anger is allowed to be anger. Fear is acknowledged instead of hidden. This does not mean being consumed by these feelings, but allowing them to exist without denial. A woman who had spent years teaching yoga described this shift. She had built her identity around being calm and composed. Her students admired her for it. But after going through a personal loss, she tried to maintain that image and found she could not. One day, while teaching, she began to cry and could not stop. She feared it would damage her reputation. Instead, it deepened the trust her students felt. They connected with her more, not less. Letting go of forced positivity creates something real. It allows for genuine connection and a deeper sense of peace that is not dependent on pretending everything is fine. The fourth thing that begins to dissolve is the need for certainty. This can be one of the most unsettling changes, but also one of the most freeing. Many people build their sense of identity on what they believe they know. They feel secure in having clear answers about who they are, what they believe, and how life works. These certainties act like a foundation, but as awakening unfolds, those fixed ideas begin to loosen. Questions arise where answers once seemed solid. The need to have everything figured out starts to fade. At first, this can feel disorienting, as if the ground beneath you is shifting. But over time, it reveals a different kind of stability, one that does not rely on rigid beliefs. Instead of clinging to certainty, you become more open, more curious, and more comfortable with not knowing. And in that openness, something unexpected happens. Life becomes less about control and more about direct experience. You begin to trust not in fixed answers, but in your ability to meet whatever arises. This shift does not remove all confusion or difficulty, but it changes your relationship to them. The need to grasp tightly at certainty softens, and in its place comes a quieter, more flexible sense of being. I've kept your script intact, lightly refined wording, removed all timestamps/music cues, and formatted it into clean paragraphs with spacing. But there is a cost to this certainty that we rarely acknowledge. When you are certain, you are closed. Your categories become rigid and fixed. New information either gets forced into the existing frame or rejected altogether. Your map of reality remains limited because you stop questioning it. Awakening has a way of dissolving certainty, not all at once but gradually. It often begins with small realizations. You recognize that an opinion you once held strongly was actually something you absorbed from your environment without ever examining it. You notice that you were wrong about something you felt completely sure of. And each small unraveling teaches you that certainty itself may be the issue, not the solution. Then the process deepens. You find yourself less certain about why things happened in your past. Less certain about other people's intentions, even those you believed you understood completely. Less certain about your own identity, about what you truly are beneath all the roles, labels, and narratives. A man who spent decades in academic research described this experience as the most unsettling gift he had ever received. He had built his entire identity around being the one who understood things, the analyst, the expert, the person with answers. And then, gradually, his intellectual certainty began to feel empty. Not exactly wrong, just incomplete. As if he had been studying the menu and calling it the meal. He said something worth sitting with. He explained that the less certain he became, the more present he felt. Because certainty lives in the past and the future, in what you have already concluded and what you think you know. Presence exists in the open, unresolved, genuinely curious moment. On the other side of lost certainty is something called wonder. The ability to be genuinely surprised by life. To not already know the answer before the question is finished. To hold two opposing ideas at the same time without needing to collapse them into a single conclusion. This is not confusion. It is what real wisdom feels like from the inside. Not the accumulation of answers, but the expansion of your ability to live within questions. The fifth thing that slowly begins to fall away is blame as a way of living. This may be the most difficult to release because it feels justified, even necessary. Not just blaming others in small, everyday ways, but the deeper habit of organizing your story around what was done to you. Making sense of your pain through the lens of who caused it. Building your identity partly around your wounds and who is responsible for them. And it is important to be honest here. Some things that happened to you were truly not your fault. Some of the harm you experienced was real and caused by real people who made choices that hurt you. Acknowledging that matters. Sitting with it matters. Processing it truthfully matters. But what we are speaking about comes after that. The moment when blame, which once helped you understand your pain, becomes the cage you live inside. Blame has a seductive logic. It explains everything. It protects your sense of innocence. It offers a sense of belonging with others who share similar pain. It provides identity. And at the same time, it quietly prevents movement. Because as long as the problem exists entirely outside of you, there is nothing you can do to change it. As people move through genuine awakening, they begin to notice patterns. The same dynamics repeating across relationships. The same kind of disappointment, betrayal, or feeling overlooked showing up in different environments. The same story with different characters. Eventually, a different question arises. Not, why does this keep happening to me? But, what role am I playing in this? Not from self-blame or shame, and not from the belief that the pain was deserved, but from a sincere desire to reclaim authorship of your own life. A woman who had carried deep and valid pain from her childhood described reaching a realization that felt both terrifying and liberating. She saw how she had built her identity around being the one who was wronged. And she saw how that identity had quietly become a way of avoiding her own power. She explained that letting go of blame did not mean excusing those who hurt her. It meant freeing herself from waiting for apologies, for understanding, for change, before allowing herself to move forward. People who release blame do not become passive or naive. They become strong in a different way. They take back the pen and begin writing their own story. The sixth pattern that begins to dissolve is using spirituality as an escape. This one is subtle and often misunderstood because it can look like growth on the surface. You go through something painful, a breakup, a loss, a personal crisis, and you respond by diving deeper into spiritual practices. You meditate more. You read about awareness, impermanence, and the nature of the self. You speak about detachment and acceptance. From the outside, this appears wise. But sometimes, the spiritual framework becomes a way of avoiding the experience rather than moving through it. You do not fully grieve, you analyze grief. You do not feel anger, you reinterpret it. You do not sit with loneliness, you convince yourself it is an illusion. This is often called spiritual bypassing, and it is a very common detour. The signs usually appear in the body. The feelings you avoid do not disappear. They remain stored, in tension, in restlessness, in unspoken heaviness. The mind may have all the right explanations, but the body still carries the truth. What real awakening asks for is embodiment, not just insight or awareness, but full participation in being human. That includes grief, longing, frustration, desire, and the basic need to be seen and cared for. A man who had practiced meditation seriously for many years came to realize this only after experiencing deep personal loss. He had the knowledge, the discipline, and the language of detachment, but he was still struggling. Not because the practice was flawed, but because he had been using it to avoid facing his own pain. He had to relearn how to feel, how to cry, how to admit fear, how to need others. He described it as returning to Earth after drifting in orbit for too long. It felt heavier and unfamiliar, but also more real than anything he had experienced in years. The invitation here is not to abandon spiritual tools, but to stop using them as a way out, to let them guide you deeper into life, not away from it. The seventh and final pattern that begins to fade is the identity of being the awakened one. This is perhaps the quietest shift, yet one of the most meaningful. In the early stages, it can feel like you are seeing something others are not. You question things differently. You notice the emptiness in pursuits that once seemed important. And this can create a sense of distance from others. There is a fork in the road here. One path turns that distance into a story of superiority. The belief that you are more aware, more evolved, more awake. This narrative can be appealing because it transforms discomfort into something flattering. The other path leads somewhere deeper. Over time, people begin to see through that story. They recognize that the sense of separation was not proof of awakening, but a reflection of unresolved needs. The need to feel above something, the fear of being ordinary, the fear of true connection. When that layer falls away, something changes. Connection becomes easier, more natural, not by pretending or lowering yourself, but by recognizing your own humanity in others. A woman who had spent years isolating herself in what she believed was spiritual protection described a moment on a flight. She found herself judging the man sitting beside her, loud, frustrated, complaining about his job. Then something shifted. She saw herself in him, not who she was now, but who she had been years before. Overwhelmed, reactive, unaware. Instead of distance, she felt warmth, recognition, a quiet compassion that did not require him to change. That is what genuine awakening looks like, Not separation, but deeper connection. Not escaping into a special group, but meeting people where they are, with honesty and understanding. These are the 7 things that gradually fall away as you begin to awaken. The hunger for approval, the need to feel special, the performance of constant positivity, the grip on certainty, the habit of blame, the use of spirituality as avoidance, and the identity of being the awakened one. What they all share is this: they are ways of managing how you are seen. They are strategies the ego uses to protect, position, and defend you from vulnerability. Letting them go is not a single moment. It is a slow, uneven process. Sometimes you release, and sometimes you hold on again. Sometimes you glimpse freedom, and other times you fall back into old patterns. This is not failure. This is the natural rhythm of growth. It is not a straight line, but a spiral. Each time you return to an old pattern, you do so with slightly more awareness. Each time you loosen your grip, even a little, something shifts. And it is important to remember this. The patterns you are letting go of were not mistakes. They served a purpose. They helped you survive, adapt, and navigate earlier stages of your life. The need for approval helped you stay connected. The need to feel special gave you motivation. Certainty gave you stability when things felt uncertain. There is no need for shame in any of it. You had to live through those patterns fully before you could outgrow them naturally. Letting go is not something you force. It happens when you are ready, when you can see clearly enough that holding on no longer makes sense. Like outgrowing a belief you once held deeply, not because you pushed it away, but because it simply no longer feels true. If you are in this process right now, if something here feels familiar rather than new, then understand this. You are not losing yourself. You are uncovering yourself. The version of you that is emerging is not smaller or more distant. It is more real, more grounded, more honest. It is the part of you that was always there beneath the roles, the expectations, and the strategies. And that part of you does not need to prove anything. It does not need approval, status, certainty, or perfection. It only needs to exist, fully present, in the life that is already here. That is enough. That has always been enough. And that is what you are slowly, steadily, and unmistakably becoming.